There's a locomotive buried in the middle of this train. Not at the front, not at the back. Wedged in there, between the grain hoppers and the container flats, like someone made a mistake. Most people who see it assume it's a spare engine, or a broken one being towed somewhere. It's neither. That engine is there to stop the train from tearing itself apart. And the reason it has to exist comes down to three separate problems that all show up the moment a train gets long enough. A brake signal that travels too slowly, a coupler that can only take so much, and a curve that wants to throw the whole thing off the rails. The conventional wisdom is that locomotives go at the front because that's where the pulling happens. For most of railroad history, that was true. But somewhere around the 1960s, engineers ran into a hard physical limit, and the fix changed how freight moves across land. Let's start with the part that surprises people most. The brake story. George Westinghouse patented his air brake in the early 1870s. It was brilliant, and in its basic form, it's still what stops freight trains today. Here's how it works. A continuous pipe runs the entire length of the train. The lead locomotive keeps that pipe pressurized. When the engineer applies the brakes, he releases pressure from the pipe. Each car senses the pressure drop and clamps its own brakes. The genius of this design is that it's fail-safe. If the train breaks apart, pressure drops and the brakes apply automatically. But it has a problem, a serious one. That pressure signal travels through the air in the pipe, and air is slow. On a train that's 1 mile long, which is not unusual, an emergency brake application takes somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds to reach the last car. A normal service application? Over a minute. Think about what that means. The front of the train is braking. The rear of the train is still rolling free. The back end runs into the front. You get what railroaders call slack action, a violent compression wave that runs through every coupler in the train. Now add a mid-train locomotive. It has its own air compressor. It can charge the brake pipe from the middle. It can apply the brakes from the middle. Suddenly, the signal doesn't have to travel the whole length of the train from one end. It meets in the middle from both directions. The whole train stops faster, more evenly, and with far less violence in the couplers. That's a big deal on its own. But there's an even more fundamental reason mid-train engines exist, and it's about a force you've probably never heard of. 2 words: buff and draft. Buff is compression, draft is tension. Every time a train accelerates, brakes, or crests a hill, these forces surge through every coupler in the train. A coupler knuckle, the hook-shaped piece of steel that connects 2 cars, is rated to hold around 390,000 pounds of force. The strongest ones top out around 650,000 pounds. That sounds like a lot, but stack enough locomotives at the front of a long train and you will exceed that. The first car behind the engines takes the full load of everything behind it. You snap a knuckle before the train even moves. So the obvious solution is spread the engines out, put some in the middle. Now the front engines are only pulling the first half of the train. The mid-train engines handle the rest. No single coupler carries the whole load. But that's still not the whole story. There's a third problem, and it only shows up on curves. It has a name. Railroaders call it string lining. Picture a long, flexible rope. You pull one end around a curve. The rope wants to cut across the inside of the curve and go straight. A train does the same thing. When you pull a very long train from the front, the in-train tension forces try to pull every car into a straight line. On a curve, that means the cars are trying to cut across the inside of the bend. That lateral force can lift the inner wheels off the rail, or push the rail itself sideways. Either way, you have a derailment. A mid-train locomotive cuts the problem in half. The section being pulled from the front is shorter. Shorter means less lateral force. Less lateral force means the wheels stay on the rail. So you have 3 separate problems: brake propagation, coupler overload, and string lining. And one solution addresses all 3 at once. That's why the engine is in the middle. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the mid-train locomotive isn't just doing the same thing as the front. It can do the opposite. Imagine a train cresting a mountain. The lead locomotives have gone over the top and are now on the downslope. They're starting to accelerate with gravity. Meanwhile, the rear of the train is still climbing. It needs power. If you apply the brakes at the front to slow the downhill section, you risk yanking the rear section, which is still under load, into a violent stretch. Snap. So what do? You run the front engines in braking mode and the mid-train engines in power mode at the same time, simultaneously pulling and braking within the same train. The lead units slow the front half. The mid-train units push the rear half forward. The couplers between them stay in compression. Loaded, but controlled. The train crests the hill in one smooth piece. Engineers who do this well describe it almost like playing an instrument. You're managing the tension and compression across every coupler by adjusting the relative power between units in real time. Get it right, and the train flows over the hill. Get it wrong, and you have a runaway or a broken coupler, or both. Now, how does the engineer in the front cab control a locomotive that's a mile behind him? Radio. The mid-train unit is completely crewless. It runs on commands transmitted at around 450 MHz from the lead cab. The engineer sets the throttle position, the brake setting, the direction, and the remote unit executes. There's a fail-safe built in. If the radio signal is lost, the remote unit doesn't hold its last command. It gradually winds its power down to zero on its own. It idles, it waits. The system is called distributed power, and the dominant version of it is called locotrol. Here's the part almost nobody knows. Locotrol wasn't invented by a railroad, it was invented by a telephone company, North Electric Company. An Ohio electronics and telephone manufacturer developed it in the 1960s. They adapted control technology from SCADA systems used to remotely operate oil pipelines and electrical utilities. The concept came partly from D.W. Brosnan, the president of Southern Railway, who saw what remote industrial control could do and applied it to trains. The first test ran on Southern Railway in 1963. The first production systems went in 2 years later. The original electronics were so bulky they needed their own dedicated railcar to house them. Today, the same function runs in a small cabinet bolted inside a locomotive. Most of the intelligence is software. Wabtec now owns Locotrol. It runs on more than 21,000 locomotives across 17 countries. It has been quietly running the world's freight network for over half a century. If you want to see what this technology makes possible at full scale, there's one example that puts everything else in perspective. June 2001, Western Australia. BHP Iron Ore runs a train 7.353 kilometres long. That's 4.5 miles, 682 ore cars, nearly 100,000 tonnes of iron ore, 5,648 wheels, 8 locomotives, not bunched at the front, threaded through the train in pairs, spread out across the full length. One driver. That driver ran that train 170 miles. It took about 10 hours. That is a Guinness World Record, and it only exists because of the engineering problem we've been talking about. Without distributed power, that train would have torn itself apart before it left the yard. Even routine BHP ore trains today run around 268 cars, stretch 2.8 kilometres, and carry 43,000 tonnes. 2 engines at the front, 2 remote-controlled units in the middle. No crew in the middle, just radio signals and software. There are rules governing all of this, by the way. Railroads don't just throw engines wherever they want. CSX limits a mid-train consist to no more than 75% of the total train length, measured from the head end. Canadian National caps the distance from the head unit to the remote at 10,500 feet, but stretches that to 14,000 feet if you have mid-train distributed power as well. The type and weight of cars placed immediately around a remote locomotive are regulated too, to reduce derailment risk if something goes wrong. Now, the fuel savings from all this are real, but modest, about 4 to 6% versus standard head-end power, depending on terrain. If that were the whole payoff, distributed power would be a nice optimization and nothing more. The real driver is economics. Precision-scheduled railroading, the industry pushed toward running fewer, longer trains with smaller crews, turned distributed power from useful into essential. You can't run a 300-car train with all the power at the front. The physics simply won't allow it. Distributed power is what makes the math work. So the next time you're at a crossing, watching a train go by, and a locomotive appears in the middle of all those cars, you'll know what you're looking at. You're looking at the answer to 3 separate engineering problems. A brake signal that travels too slowly, a coupler that can only take so much, and a curve that wants to throw the whole thing off the rails. The mid-train engine isn't extra muscle, It's a structural solution. It's the reason the train arrives at all. And here's the thing that gets me about this. The freight network moves quietly. Most people never think about it. But the trains running through the night, carrying everything from grain to steel to the components inside your phone, are doing it with engineering that started in a telephone company in Ohio, borrowed from oil pipeline control systems, and was first tested 60 years ago on a single stretch of track in the American South. The world's infrastructure is full of solutions like this. Invisible, counterintuitive, and absolutely essential. If that kind of thing interests you, and I suspect it does, or you wouldn't still be here, drop a comment with the infrastructure topic you want explained next. The best suggestions tend to become the next video.